Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope you had a great time checking in with one another. And welcome again to Sunday Morning Zen, a program of the Zen Life and Meditation Center here in beautiful Oak Park. So happy to have you with us this morning. Got a fine, happy throng here at the center, as well as a buoyant group online. So it's going to be wonderful. I think everyone's lined up and excited for this morning's speaker, but no pressure on Karleen this morning. So Karleen Manchanda has been an online member with ZLMC since 2021, and she participates in programs from her home in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is up in Canada, our international extension up there in Canada. She's a Zen Life teacher and a Zen student, and she's also a board member here at ZLMC, so she helps guide the center in a lot of wonderful ways, and we're very excited to have her. She's held a master's degree of education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and has a strong interest in teaching mindfulness and meditation to children, teachers, and caregivers. And this morning, she's going to give us a talk titled, Open the Window and Let Your Life In. So I'll turn it over to you, Karleen. So happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I'm just going to remove my spotlight because I don't care to see my face in a large view for the whole time I'm talking. Yeah, as Michael said, for those of you that I haven't had an opportunity to meet yet, my name is Karleen. My pronouns are she and her, and yeah, I'm a relatively new member of the ZLMC, but I have been so grateful for this Sangha through the pandemic and beyond. It has made involvement with it has made a difference in my life and brought me a lot of joy and a kind of a new direction as well. I'd like to begin and with a little explanation. I'm going to pre-apologize that I had a bit of a technical issue, and I'm using two different devices, one to read from and one to do the video. So pardon me if my eye contact kind of varies through the talk. It's just dealing with what is right now. But I'd like to begin actually with the land acknowledgement. I do live in Canada, and as a settler in Winnipeg in the province of Manitoba, I wish to acknowledge that the land that I live, work, and play in was originally inhabited by the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, the Dakota, Dene, and Métis peoples. And the water that sustains me is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And I offer this acknowledgement with the intention of encouraging an awareness and right understanding of the historical sufferings of Indigenous peoples that continues to affect all of us in our lives today. And so beginning my talk in this way may cause some feelings of discomfort or resistance or perhaps even upset, but while this may be challenging, I think both the acknowledgement of suffering and the ways we respond to suffering are actually quite relevant to the topic of my talk today, which, as Michael said, is open the window and let your life in. And the window that I'm referring to is known in psychology circles as the window of tolerance. And mention has been made of the foundations of mindfulness classes, and this model is something that is usually introduced in the foundation series. That was one of my first introductions to it, but since that time, it's taken on a new meaning for me, and this is why I'd like to share it with you today. And I'll just begin, with the basic question of what is the window of tolerance? The term was coined and developed by the work of Dr. Dan Siegel, and he is a clinical professor of psychiatry and also the co-founder of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. And it's a way of thinking about how we're able to tolerate and respond to our experiences in life. And there's a quote that I'd like to share by a psychotherapist and Zen practitioner in Canada. Her name is Sarah Noble, and she describes the window of tolerance as this. She says, our window of tolerance is the zone of arousal where our nervous systems are most regulated. We feel a sense of safety and are able to function, communicate, and connect most effectively. When we leave this zone, we go into our survival mode of fight, flight, or freeze. And so if we imagine the window is kind of the old-fashioned, sliding window from in our daily life, our window of tolerance, actually, we have many windows, or we can think of one window that slides open and closed, depending on the situation we find ourselves in. And when we're within this center section of our window, we can sort of experience the ebb and flow of emotions like anxiety or anger, frustration, sadness, loneliness, that may bring us close to the edges of the window, but don't overwhelm our nervous system and don't trigger those primitive fight, flight, and freeze mechanisms to kick in, that don't override our capacity to calm and connect and to relax and reason. An example of different windows of tolerance in preparing for this talk, I was reminded that I often have a very narrow window of tolerance for feelings of fear. In the case of the talk, it's a fear of judgment. Is it going to be a good talk? What are people going to think? In other cases, for me, it may be a fear for the well-being of my kids. However, my window of tolerance for emotions like sadness tend to be a little bit wider. And so each of us sort of has these different ranges. And what's useful is to develop an awareness of where we are. Are we within our window of tolerance, or have we gone beyond it? When we react to things, is that coming from a place of calm and reason, or is that coming from a place of protectiveness, where our nervous system moves from the rational thinking part of our brain into that really primitive survival mode part of our brain? And I'd like to make sure to point out that when we become what's known as dysregulated, right, when we're not sort of in that even keel or able to tolerate the ups and downs, and we get a bit dysregulated, it's not a bad thing. It's not that being outside is bad and being inside the window is good, right? Just like in our meditation, it's not that, we can let go of our thinking and that's always good, and I can't let go and that's bad. It's not a judgment in that way. I think the way that I like to think about it is that it's developing an awareness of what is actually happening inside of us in response to whatever is going on. So the wider or more open our window of tolerance is, the more we can feel present and calm and empathetic, because we can kind of feel and reason at the same time. We can hold both of those things. The narrower, more closed our window of tolerance is, the more easily we become dysregulated or overwhelmed. And that's when we shift into protective survival mode and have reactions like fighting or running away or numbing and shutting down. So it's our optimal zone for connection, for staying in relationship with our experiences, to be with, in kind of Buddhist terms or lingo, to be with and stay with whatever is present. And Dan Siegel says that as we widen our window of tolerance, because we can widen it, then we can experience the fullness of our lives with more acceptance and clarity. So why has this topic become so important to me right now? Well, over the past 5 months, life has offered me these experiences. COVID, 3 out of the 4 members of our family got COVID, and my symptoms lingered for about a month or more. I also received carpenter ants nesting in the walls of our home. I received transition. It's a time of transition in our house. Children moving from high school to university, children moving from college to career. And perhaps most influential was the experience of pain, actually. And this is when I learned that a loved one was suffering from a trauma, and I had to figure out how to support them to recover from that trauma. And so the stresses of all these situations really has, and it continues in a certain degree, to leave me feeling less grounded, just more easily overwhelmed, fatigued, and I would say my family might say occasionally less enjoyable to be around. But in the process of trying to resource myself, particularly to support my loved one, I sought some counseling and attended workshops to learn about trauma. And what was really fascinating for me was to realize how this theme of understanding a window of tolerance came up consistently in learning how to deal with our situation in our family. And the importance of that is sort of why it's made me think, okay, so in trauma work, knowing about the window of tolerance is really critical. In therapy work, it's really critical. And so I took a little further dive into this concept, and I realized that, without the ability to sort of remain in or return to our state of equilibrium or regulation, then we struggle. We struggle to relate to others. We struggle to relate to our experience. And we really cannot access our capacity to reason and make sense of what's happening. And then I began to see that there was value in using this window of tolerance, not just as a tool for overall well-being, emotional well-being, but also as a skillful means to support spiritual growth. And so then, at this point, I would like to turn to why this window of tolerance could be helpful for us on the Zen path. So if we, at the center, we define, Zen-inspired living as a life of openness, empathy, and clarity, right? And so the wider our window of tolerance, the more open we become to receiving all of life, whatever life happens to offer us. The greater our awareness of how wide or narrow our window of tolerance is, the more clarity we have about either skillfully responding versus automatically reacting to our experience. And the more that we understand our own window of tolerance, the more empathy we begin to develop towards others who may be struggling outside of their own window of tolerance. We start to see, that behavior, which I'm taking really personally, that may actually be because this individual is struggling because they're outside of their own window of tolerance. So we don't need to respond to them. We may have a more compassionate response, in relating to them. And as bodhisattvas, right, our capacity to tend to the suffering of others greatly depends upon how well we take care of our own suffering. And so an awareness of our window of tolerance can help us on this path. And additionally, as I sort of contemplated this concept, I realized that, and I see this in my own life particularly, that when we open the window of tolerance, it not only lets life in, it not only lets us receive our life experiences, But that opening of the window then also allows us to give or send out our gifts to the world. So, for these reasons, I felt like it was useful to share, you know, and so let's maybe take a look at what narrows our window. And again, not as this is bad, but what things can we be aware of to notice what might cause our window to narrow, right? And one really basic thing is what I'm calling sort of shaky foundations. Really basic things like a lack of sleep, an illness, mental and physical health challenges, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, underlying stress, substance misuse. These kinds of fundamental building blocks for our well-being, when they're shaky, that can certainly narrow our window of tolerance, how we, respond to things. As I've mentioned, stress and trauma can narrow the window. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting to highlight is also a lack of connection. Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician that's really well known for his work in the areas of trauma and mental health. And he has a saying, he says, safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. And this could mean a connection with ourselves, could mean with others, it could even mean with the environment. But whenever our sense of connection is severed, it leaves us feeling vulnerable. And this increases our need to feel like we have to protect ourselves. And this affects our sense of safety, which then can narrow that window. And so, as I was sort of listing out these elements that can narrow the window, I thought to myself, does this sound like the pandemic? For many of us, the adversities and anxieties of the pandemic have narrowed our window of tolerance because they pretty much cover almost every aspect of this in people's lives, one way or another. And so it's not all gloom and doom, though. These things can affect it, our window, but we can also, conversely, widen our window. And the widening of that window, amazingly, but not surprisingly, maybe for all of us, things that are consistently recommended are mindfulness, self-compassion, meditation. And we look at these practices, why is it that mindfulness would help? Well, it's the intentional, embodied, and non-judgmental attention to what is present. So if we can bring that quality of attention to whatever arrives in our life, that helps us to be with it and stay with it and not feel pulled towards getting overwhelmed. With self-compassion, you acknowledge suffering. You don't try to push it away or run away from it. You acknowledge it. And you recognize that you're not alone in your struggle. And then you offer yourself kindness, right? Just as you would to a friend. And of course, with meditation, we practice staying present to whatever might arise. So one phrase that I really love that Jack Kornfield often uses, Jack Kornfield is an insight meditation teacher and Buddhist psychologist who's well known and well loved by many. He says, take the one seat. And this phrase comes from his teacher, Ajahn Chah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but this is what Jack Kornfield says in relation to the practice of meditation. He says, spiritual transformation is a profound process that doesn't happen by accident. We need a repeated discipline a genuine training in order to let go of old habits of mind and to find and sustain a new way of seeing. To mature on the spiritual path, we need to commit ourselves in a systematic way. My teacher, Ajahn Chah, described this commitment as taking the one seat. He said, just go into the room and put one chair in the center. Take the one seat in the center of the room. Open the doors and windows and see who comes to visit. You will witness all kinds of scenes and actors, all kinds of temptations and stories, everything imaginable. Your only job is to stay in your seat. You will see it all arise and pass, and out of this, wisdom and understanding will come. And I love this image of taking the one seat, because of course you're the only one who can take the seat in your own life. You know, and I'd like to add though that, you know, while we often encourage sitting and staying, there are, you know, I want to acknowledge that there are experiences, there can be experiences in our lives where, you know, particularly ones of trauma, where it can be overwhelming to stay. And so in those cases, it is not, you know, it is not a failure or a reflection of shortcoming on our part if we cannot stay initially. And if we realize that, you know, we need support, whether that's from a helping professional or a trusted friend or a teacher, this is important to recognize that while we, you know, sort of aspire maybe to be able to stay in the face of difficulties, it is not something, it's not something you have to learn to do all on your own. And I also love Thich Nhat Hanh's description of shamatha, or the sort of single-pointed attention. And he describes this kind of meditation as stopping, calming, resting, and healing. It's just sort of a beautiful progression of what can happen, you know, when we practice regularly sitting with our breath. So the practice of shamatha, stopping, he says, is fundamental. If we cannot stop, we cannot have insight. And resting is a precondition for healing. And he cites the example of, you know, wild animals. If they're injured, they know they have to stop in order to heal. They don't just keep pushing themselves to go further and further as we humans do. And so these ideas that in meditation, when we practice stopping, we practice taking the one seat, staying, these are all things that help us to widen that window of tolerance. And I'd like to share one other practice that was particularly helpful for me in trying to, in going through supporting my loved one that was recovering from trauma. And this is the Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen. And this is, you know, usually Tong means sending out or letting go, and Len means receiving or accepting. So it's the practice of sending and receiving. And I am not, you know, familiar with the in-depth practice of it, but Pema Chodron, you know, she advocates for on-the-spot Tonglen is what she calls it. And it's a more informal kind of spontaneous practice when you feel, you know, strong feelings arising. And the essential steps are to ground, to breathe in the bad, and then breathe out the good. And one, in doing so, connecting to the suffering of all beings. So as an example, for this loved one who was suffering, sometimes that would cause a lot of pain for me because there was only so much that I could do to ease that suffering. And so the Tonglen, which was recommended to me by my friend Barb Barnes, she said, you can try this. And I did, and it was very helpful. I would breathe in all the mothers who have suffered in having to, watch or support a loved one that was suffering. I would breathe that in, and then I would breathe out relief from that suffering. And it's interesting because on the surface, one would think, why would we want to take in bad? That doesn't seems very counterintuitive. And I'm not sure how that would help. But what's interesting is that by breathing that in and trying to keep a really open heart while you breathe that in, it actually begins slowly to expand sort of your capacity for being with things that are difficult and hard and dark. And by breathing it out, there comes a bit of relief for yourself because you feel, especially in a case like mine, where you feel almost somewhat helpless sometimes, your capacity for helping. You feel like when you're breathing out relief from suffering for all those who are suffering, that you are actually able to offer something. You are able to give something rather than just feel and sit with the pain. So the practice of Tonglen is definitely something that I feel or have found that can help to widen that window of tolerance. And so, how do we go from just tolerance to transformation? Well, I think that what we can tolerate, we can stay with, we can then work with, and in being able to stay with and be with and work with, that's how transformation happens. And again, I take the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, where he talks about this sort of sequence towards transformation, where you receive, you embrace, and then transform. And so as we, widen our window of tolerance, it increases our capacity to receive what's offered to us in life, and to embrace it, to give it attention and care, and then to allow it to transform into wisdom, the wisdom that can come from that suffering. And in closing, I wanted to share a couple of quotes actually. One is from Bo Forbes, who is both a psychologist and a yoga educator. And she says that it may seem that transformation is about transcendence, that we somehow leave behind our flaws to achieve a measure of spiritual perfection. Yet true spiritual evolution and emotional health entail a reckoning with and even valuing of the unique set of challenges we've been given, right? So this transformation involves reckoning with and valuing the challenges, not leaving them behind or getting rid of them. And again, I turn to Jack Kornfield, who says that what matters in the realm of awakening is not the particular experience we have, but whether that too can be made into our practice, whether we can stay open to what is present and learn to love in this place as well. Thank you. I would welcome any reflections or questions or comments.
Karleen, thank you. That's so hopeful and helpful. Thank you so much.
Sandy.
Karleen, that was such a rich talk, just full of wonderful things to think about. So I took some notes and I'm going to try to really just bring it in. So thank you for your thoughtful presentation. Really helpful.
I'm glad. Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, Karleen, I agree. What just a great talk. There's so much I could comment on, but I really appreciate you mentioning at the beginning that our window of tolerance may be different for different emotions or different situations. We may be really okay dealing with maybe stress is something that we can actually handle quite a bit of, but irritation or anger is something that we've got a really narrow window of tolerance. I think that's really important for us to be aware of. And I also loved you talking about sort of, what did you say, shaky foundation? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I know for myself that I discount how important some of that stuff is to my ability to tolerate other situations that come along. And two comments related to that. One, I'm thinking of Anne Lamott, who some of you may read and love, and how she says that, sometimes you just need a sandwich.
Yes.
Go make yourself a sandwich that
That's right.
And and then I belong to another fellowship where we have an acronym that's called HALT. And the acronym is, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired?
Mhm.
And just sort of like before I take an action, before I respond or react, just kind of take a pause and see if any of those things may be operating. So again, just a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Karleen, I think one of the hardest things to do is to bear witness. And I think you really shared with us the things that have been helpful for you and a reminder to myself to draw on those things. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk.
Karleen, I really appreciated your talk. It was very rich, and as you usually do, you cover a lot of bases. And I love the way you're integrating the curriculum of from the foundations, and just taking one point like the window of tolerance and really exploring it and offering very practical guidelines. The one thing I I also really appreciate the fact that your sensitivity to trauma. I think there's so much trauma right now. And I think we're all experiencing it on some level. And it's important not to, one thing that creates more trauma is our judgment about it. So I think when we're not in the window of tolerance, we're often hard on ourselves in a way that makes it hard to be in the window of tolerance. So this sense of being able to accept our inadequacies and our failures and all our, all the ways that we don't live up to whatever we expect ourselves to live up to. It's really important to have some loving kindness towards our humanity, really, our just being human beings. So very practical and down to earth. I really loved your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roshi. I'm so glad that you mentioned that too, because yes, just because we meditate or practice mindfulness doesn't mean that we should expect ourselves to always have a wide window, right? That's not the idea or the goal, or it's that judgment just adds another layer. So yes, thank you
Well,
for bringing that forward.
I think it's important to say that meditation is valuable, but we can create an ideal out of meditation
Yes.
where we then have some expectation that if we meditate, we're not going to have any pain or suffering.
Exactly.
And really, that's just a death, you know?
Yes.
That would
It's
be
not-
death. To not have any problems or any suffering would be. So again, thank you so much, Karleen. Wonderful talk.
Thank you, Roshi.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Karleen. I just hope you stay with us in Canada.
Thank you, Karleen. Really appreciated that as well. Yeah, mindfulness helps you know how to halt, actually, and you can see that you're being really kind of tight here, and maybe there's something else that you can do. But and just that last line of yours about loving even the difficult situation you find yourself in at some point, perhaps not at that moment, but as you work with it and then you reflect that, yes, this has made you a stronger person. Yeah, so thank you very much. Stronger, more heartful person.
Thank you, Karleen, for a wonderful talk. I especially appreciated your mentioning the native peoples in Canada at the beginning of the talk, who have given us so much inspiration. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
excuse